Hello everyone, I'm Rachel and I'm going to be talking about eating disorders in the military. So the first thing we're going to start with is what is an eating disorder? And essentially an eating disorder is sort of restricting the food intake. It's both a health mindset and also a psychological mindset. So you might be restricting the food or even expelling the food. And I've listed the definition here that comes out of the DSM-5 for an eating disorder. Even in these days, it's also called disordered eating. So searching for different research articles, both terms can be used. Eating disorders tend to be higher in female populations than male populations. And there's sometimes a desire to be thin or sometimes a desire or being repulsed at being overweight. Additionally, not just eating disorders, but you can also be using weight control behaviors, and I've listed a definition there from a couple of different people, and I think that those weight control behaviors give a good picture of sort of different behaviors that people use. And the use of these weight control behaviors doesn't necessarily qualify an individual for an eating disorder. And I think the tricky part with weight control behaviors is that it can be played off as being healthy. So someone who exercises twice a day, like maybe you only have time to do cardio in the morning and then you lift weights in the afternoon. And sort of how much someone can tolerate exercise is up to each individual. But I think the trickier part about this, again, is that they seem to be healthier choices. So these are the classifications coming out of the DSM-5 of the different types of feeding and eating disorders found in there. So we have rumination disorder, avoidant restrictive, bulimia nervosa, other specified feeding or eating disorder. The ones that are in bold, I'm going to be listing those definitions because those are the ones that were most pertinent in the information that I found in regards to the military. So anorexia nervosa is basically a restriction of the food that you put into your body. It's an intense fear of gaining weight or becoming fat, and it really disturbs a person's mindset and how they view themselves and what they look like. Bulimia nervosa really is not necessarily restricting the food, but in some ways I think of it as like expelling the food. So it might be induced vomiting, it might be using laxatives excessively, it might be excessive exercise. This is consistent behavior that happens once a week for at least 3 months according to the DSM-5. Binge eating disorder is when someone is eating an excessive amount of food, eating faster than usual, sometimes eating by themselves because they're ashamed, even feeling disgusted or depressed after eating the food and for thinking about what they've done. And again, this same behavior also happens at least once a week for 3 months, according to the DSM-5. The other specified eating disorder is a category that a clinician might use if an individual doesn't meet any of the other 3 categories or maybe meet some of the categories but not quite. So the other specified is how they would be labeled essentially. So in the general population, there are a lot of general stressors that would contribute to an individual having an eating disorder. In general, it's seen with younger people, like 15 to 18-ish, and a lot of college students. And so the cultural expectations and standards oftentimes tend to be unrealistic. Even this picture here of these women in their bikinis is a bikini fitness competition, and that's not even getting into the bodybuilder or the fitness one. It's just the bikini, the first level there. If you are an athlete too, sometimes there can be an emphasis on, elite athleticism as well as your physical appearance. And so like a bodybuilder or a wrestler or a gymnast as well. I also put a picture of men's advertising right here to say that men aren't excluded from this as well. I couldn't find any direct information linking the adverse childhood experiences to eating disorders, but based on what we know about the brain and how each of those adverse experiences sort of contribute to stress and how people handle stress, I do believe some of those adverse experiences would contribute towards an eating disorder. So then looking at eating disorders in the military, so there are enough life stressors of their own, and so the previous ones I already listed, but then you can get into things like divorce and bullying or moving or the loss of a loved one. Those coupled with the specific military stresses of their own just creates this perfect storm for a person to develop an eating disorder. And in the military, the more specific ones would be like military sexual harassment, exposure to combat, and then the weight standards. So these put people at risk for mental health and health issues in general. In the military, the rates of eating disorders are higher for the military than general population, and more specifically with women, the rates are higher again. So in the research that I did, there was information before 2001, which is sort of that 9/11 mark, and then after 2001. And I did use some information from 2001 because some of those were the only numbers that I could find. But the information also was changing after that, as you have more women in the military and more women facing combat. And in addition, there were some changes to the DSM-4 and the DSM-5 in diagnosing, which makes a little bit of a difference because it used to be binge purging, and that's not that category anymore. Furthermore, in the military, if you are diagnosed with an eating disorder after the age of 13, that would automatically medically disqualify you from entering any of the military branches. So if someone was diagnosed with an eating disorder, they may not reveal that in their intake assessment or in their screening process, because if that's something they're striving for to be a part of the military, they don't want to risk that chance. And a lot of these studies were done with self-report, and so if you're the one with an eating disorder, you may not perceive that you have a problem and may not report that accurately. So these numbers may be lower than they actually are. And again, the studies focused on anorexia nervosa, bulimia nervosa, binge eating, and not otherwise specified. So when we're looking at eating disorders in the military, we have several different factors. First, just the military itself is a factor to developing an eating disorder, but then the weight standards are a category of their own in contributing to developing an eating disorder. Military sexual trauma can also be a contributing factor, and then combat exposure and PTSD. And I recognize those could be two different categories, but based on the information I found, I kept them together. So for the military itself, if you have an individual coming into the military who's already a high achiever or prone to perfectionism, when they enter that military environment, it's going to exacerbate those qualities that individual displays to begin with and puts them more at risk. And then with the emphasis in the military on the athleticism and being strong and having lower body fat, this can place a tremendous amount of pressure on service members to look a certain way. Additionally, requiring people to attend meals together and having fewer food alternatives can sort of place stress on a person in thinking about what they want to eat or how they want to eat. A study from 2001 suggested that having fewer low-fat alternatives also is a risk factor, but I felt like that information was a little bit old because with the studies that are out now, low-fat actually turns out to be not so great, so there's definitely a need for more current research. And one thing I hadn't thought about, but were the uniforms that women wear. They may not feel comfortable in them, they might feel overweight or unattractive, and that could lead to making weight control behavior choices that eventually develop into an eating disorder. Furthermore, in the military, factors which put soldiers at a higher risk if they're coming in to begin with is being a female, being overweight actually, if they've had a previous psychiatric history or a history of verbal abuse, and I would say any abuse in general. Several studies stated that in the military, cadets, active duty, and young women are also the most vulnerable here. With eating disorders often come mood or personality disorders, and so the treatment of an eating disorder can often be very tricky at times. If there's been a previous history of substance abuse, that also makes a big difference as well. And additionally, while the Don't Ask, Don't Tell was originally for people who were identified as being homosexual, I think this applies for mental health issues as well. Don't ask, don't tell. So the 2001 study by McNulty were the numbers that I was able to find on people who would qualify for an eating disorder in the military. If you are diagnosed with an eating disorder in the military, that is grounds for being dismissed from the military. So this was a survey that she sent out to over 3,000 active duty women, and they self-reported. And these are the numbers that would qualify women for eating disorders. These are eating disorders that are broken down by military branches, and you can see the all military, anorexia, bulimia, and not otherwise specified. The weight standards also, there was a lot of information about the weight standards in the military. Weight standards are measured twice a year, and if a member doesn't meet that standard, then they are required to enter a remedial weight program. The pressure that this puts on members is very high, and there's lots of shame and anxiety associated with it, especially if there's a public weigh-in as well. And not meeting weight standards could put a member at risk for losing their job, not advancing, not deploying, and there are lots of detrimental effects for not meeting the weight standards. In addition, those on special diets are also at risk for disordered eating. The short-term weight programs do not have long-term effects, and there may be cycles. So that's what a lot of the research said, that as the weight check-in comes up, people sort of go into this hyperactive mode, using the saunas or using diuretics, exercising excessively to, be able to shed that 1 or 2 pounds that's needed, or even more at times. Here are the weight standards for the Army that I found, and I would not meet the weight standards at this point, but it's only by a couple of pounds, so I could see why it would be easy to do a couple of extreme behaviors to meet that weight standard. There was only a little bit of information I found on the military sexual trauma, but for women or men who have experienced military sexual trauma, it was very interesting. For some, if they felt their bodies betrayed them. So there was an example of a man, maybe he had an erection during an assault. Then as a way to sort of feel as if they're control, some people might turn to controlling their food or obsessing over their body image. With the combat exposure and PTSD, now you have more women in the military, you have longer tours, and you have multiple tours. And so as women and men are being faced with combat exposure and facing that trauma, it turns out that those who are deployed and face the combat exposure are coming back and developing or develop eating disorders on the field. Those are the ones that actually have the highest numbers, are women and men exposed to combat while being deployed. And there's just some more information there. So even though the food that soldiers are receiving there's more of it and there's better quality, many people are coming back having lost weight. So again, it's not the deployment that contributes to an eating disorder, it's the exposure to combat and the trauma that it brings with it. Oftentimes, eating disorders get underreported, and this is the same for many of the same reasons that we would find in mental health. There's a lot of a stigma avoided or associated with it. There might be embarrassment of how you're viewed by your peers or your chain of command. And in civilian life, your boss wouldn't know if you have an eating disorder. Additionally, men and eating disorders in the military does happen. I had trouble finding information about it. Males may be less likely to report because they view it as a female issue, but really probably where the research needs to be done is men and the amount of exercising that is done, because that can qualify someone for an eating disorder. So treatment and intervention can actually be pretty complicated because treatment needs to be pretty intensive and it needs to be fairly specific. And if someone relapses, they're bound to relapse again and again. And really, treatment probably would be best sought outside of the military. There are a number of limited programs in the military, and actually I found information that said there are no eating disorder treatment programs within the military. And programs can be from inpatient to outpatient, just a number of different methods that can be intervened here. Prevention really is the key in all of this, and so increasing awareness of health care providers is very big. There are some programs slowly being implemented, like at the Naval Academy, and really there also needs to be more policy improvements. And having a supportive chain of command can make a huge difference for an individual. Teresa Larson was a former Marine lieutenant, and she is doing a lot of work in advocacy And as of this month, there is now funding available through the Department of Defense for more research for those experiencing eating disorders within the military.